When I was a little girl, I remember driving on I-44 with my mom past the desolate remains of what used to be Times Beach. The street sat empty save for the dark, windowless husks of decaying, abandoned houses. And she would always tell me the story about how that was where everyone had to be evacuated because of toxic waste contamination, even though I was barely old enough to understand what that meant at first. Every time we'd drive by on our way out into St. Louis County to visit family, I'd get that tingly feeling in the pit of my stomach, knowing we were going to pass by it. In my young mind, I thought if any place was truly haunted, it had to be Times Beach.
I just remember it being one of those places of legend, you know. We drove this corridor a lot because it was I-44, so I just remember looking down there and you'd see all the houses still there. Streets, there were buildings, there were windowless buildings and street signs, and just no people. And it just looked like a movie set for a horror film or something.
The official story goes like this. 17 miles southwest of St. Louis sat Times Beach, a small community which began as a summer resort back in the 1920s. By the 1970s, it had become a low-income housing community with a population of 1,240 people that could not afford to pave its dusty roads. In an effort to control the dust, the city hired waste oil hauler Russell Bliss to spray them down, which he did multiple times between 1972 and 1976. The government would later claim Bliss obtained the dioxin-laced waste in 1971 from a Verona, Missouri chemical plant where toxic byproducts, including the byproduct of Agent Orange, was manufactured. Waste Bliss mixed in with the oils he sprayed on Times Beach roads as his means of disposing it. This plant would later show concentrations of dioxin at up to 2,000 times higher than that found in Agent Orange itself. By 1985, Times Beach was disincorporated, evacuated, and quarantined, save for one elderly couple who refused to leave. The town wasn't demolished until 1992. More than 265,000 tons of tainted soils were incinerated at the site beginning in 1996, and by 1999 all was declared well, and the state opened up a Route 66-themed park where the town once stood.
So out of this whole place, filled with all this stuff, knickknacks and everything else, there's really just this one little corner that barely glosses over what actually happened at Times Beach.
There was nothing in there about those chemical companies. The chemical companies responsible for this weren't even mentioned.
The argument is they turned this into a Route 66 state park in Missouri, but the only reason they converted it to a state park is because they had to totally destroy the entire town, bury and burn it. Then they decided to paste that over to help people eventually forget about it. That's why it's not mentioned. And they just grabbed on to whatever was right there, which is Route 66.
The whole incident went down as the largest civilian dioxin exposure in U.S. history, but between the time the roads were sprayed with several dangerous deadly chemicals and the time the EPA declared one of the greatest triumphs over environmental disaster had come to an end in 1997, a lot of conflicting information and unresolved details still leave many unanswered questions about Times Beach. Bliss came under scrutiny after he sprayed his oil mixtures at several horse farms, including a May 1971 incident at Shenandoah Stable, after he sprayed 2,000 gallons of a thick, pungent waste oil with a foul burning odor at Judy Pyatt's indoor arena. In the weeks that followed, birds began dropping dead, dogs and cats were falling ill, and horses who came near the place developed sores and began losing their hair. Judy and her kids got headaches, nosebleeds, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. After just a few months, over 60 horses died. When Judy called him on it, Bliss claimed he had sprayed nothing more than used motor oil. What Bliss failed to mention is that prior to spraying her farm, he had mixed that old motor oil with other batches of waste he'd been paid to dispose of, including from the Independent Petrochemical Corporation, IPC. IPC paid Bliss to dispose of the waste material, which it in turn had received from Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company Nepico. Nepico had been manufacturing hexachlorophene, which produces dioxin, a very toxic byproduct of Agent Orange, which Nepico had also been producing during the Vietnam War. Throughout 1971, Bliss received 18,000 gallons or 6 truckloads of waste tainted with the probable human carcinogen and mixed it with the used motor oil he'd been spraying on farms and roads for dust. After more horses dropped dead at other farms Bliss sprayed, the CDC got involved in August 1971, collecting soil and human and animal blood samples. They found deadly PCBs right away, but it wasn't until July 1974 they detected up to 30 parts per million of dioxin from the Shenandoah samples. Meanwhile, Bliss had already been spraying the over 20 miles of roads at Times Beach intermittently for 3 years. Even though Bliss was under investigation for improperly disposing of hazardous toxic waste, and the government knew where he was spraying his waste oils, no one informed the people of Times Beach. Skip ahead to 1979 when a NEPACO employee finally blew the whistle on the company's shoddy dioxin disposal practices, including the burial of 90 corroded, leaky drums of toxic waste on a nearby farm for a measly $150. That's when the EPA officially got involved.
The EPA was sending out letters. They're sending out letters to these chemical companies and the agribusiness companies that were producing the toxic waste. In 1980, they're sending out a letter. So, you're producing this toxic waste, you're not disposing of it properly. Here's a letter. Could you please not do that? Sincerely, thank you, EPA. Like, that's going to really help the people that are going to suffer from the consequence of dumping toxic waste on their lawn? I mean, really, a letter?
By mid-1982, the agency was making rounds on the farms and visited Times Beach as well, but still no one informed the town itself. The Environmental Defense Fund leaked an internal EPA document detailing that the agency had previously known of 14 confirmed and 41 possibly contaminated sites in Missouri, with Times Beach at the top of the list. According to the town's last mayor, Marilyn Leisner, Times Beach wasn't told about its potential poisoning until November 1982, when a reporter called and informed the city clerk that Bliss might have doused the place with dioxin. A call from the EPA quickly followed, officially informing the clerk that Times Beach was a suspected dioxin dump site, but that it might be 9 more months before any soil testing could be done. The town devolved into chaos at the news. Many residents immediately remembered the city's streets had turned a particularly alarming shade of purple after Bliss sprayed there, and animals including birds and dogs had also died. One resident even collected some of the dead birds and contacted the St. Louis Health Department, who instructed him to freeze the birds, but no one ever came to retrieve and test them. The roads commissioner recalled that the city had finally ordered Bliss to stop oiling Times Beach, but just a few days later found one of his drivers had dumped an entire tank of waste into an undeveloped part of the city, the part that would soon become the town's baseball field. The townspeople demanded answers and threatened the EPA that if the agency didn't come test the soil right away, they'd pay for their own independent samples to be taken and make the results public. And that made the EPA speed up their schedule just a bit. The first round of samples were collected on December 3, 1982. Unfortunately for Times Beach, that wouldn't be their only problem. Due to massive rains, 2 days later on December 5th, the Merrimack River flooded, putting over 95% of Times Beach under 10 feet or more of water, and the town was evacuated. The EPA wouldn't come back with its soil sample results until December 23rd. Not only was dioxin found at levels 100 times higher than the 1 part per billion generally considered to be hazardous to human health, but 9 other toxic priority pollutants were found in the soils there, including PCBs in the park, a finding also confirmed by the town's independent soil samples. 2 days before Christmas, the EPA told the residents, "If you're in town, it's advisable for you to leave, and if you're out of town, don't go back." Later, it came out that while the CDC had discovered dioxin in dangerously high concentrations at the Verona plant, interestingly, no PCBs were ever found at that plant. And as it turns out, IPC and NEPACO weren't Bliss's only clients. He also had contracts with major corporations, including Monsanto. Monsanto denied this outright, but multiple Bliss drivers testified over the years that they had picked up waste from Monsanto on multiple occasions, including Bliss himself, who told a Missouri Assistant Attorney General on the record that Monsanto was his biggest client. Missouri Department of Natural Resources had not only received 2 contracts between Bliss and Monsanto dated 1975 and 1976, but at a 1977 hearing, evidence was presented that a Bliss driver had dumped a toxic chemical exclusive to Monsanto at a site in Jefferson County, which Bliss subsequently testified came from a Monsanto research lab. Judy Pyatt of Shenandoah Stable further claimed that she too had gathered evidence Bliss drivers had picked up waste from Monsanto locations. She was awarded multiple lawsuits, including an IPC payout of $1 million to each of her daughters in 1983. In a lovely little trick of semantics, when Riverfront Times contacted Monsanto about these allegations, company spokeswoman responded with a prepared statement that, quote, no information exists that any dioxin material was hauled by Bliss for Monsanto, and so no material from Monsanto would have been sprayed on roads. But one does not automatically equal the other, now does it? Once the EPA and DNR had zeroed in on the Verona plant as the sole source of the contamination, that was it, their investigation was over. Activist Steve Taylor of the Times Beach Action Group told reporters leads weren't followed up on if they didn't fit into the theory of where the waste came from, despite the fact that, again, no PCBs were ever found at the Verona plant. The EPA was able to conclude all of this, by the way, without the agency ever having actually interviewed Russell Bliss. Dioxin is a probable carcinogen that's been linked to skin diseases, immune disorders, and birth defects. Over 800 families were forced to leave their lives and belongings behind at Times Beach. People's lives were ruined. Many were left homeless. Residents got sick, and the sick got sicker. Children learned from the news media that animals fed Times Beach soil. The very soil they'd been playing on for years was killing the animals. When they did move, kids at their new schools refused to play with the Times Beach children and treated them like diseased outcasts, and so did their new neighbors.
I mean, this changed these people's lives forever. They didn't just lose their house. It wasn't like they just lost a house and was like, oh, well, I'll just move, I guess, and go buy a new house. Places wouldn't give them insurance because they knew that they had been exposed to all these harmful chemicals and hazardous toxic waste, and so they were a liability. And you know you're probably at higher risk for health problems now because you've been exposed to deadly chemicals that cause every manner of horrible health disorder. What are you going to do? They were outcast from society because they were treated like they were walking around with the Ebola virus. If people found out in local neighboring communities that you were from Times Beach, well, then they didn't want anything to do with you. So it wasn't like these people could just move. I'm just going to move one neighborhood over and get a new job and start my life over. It wasn't like that at all. And they probably had to not tell people where they were from.
Mayor Leisner noted that as health problems increased among the Times Beach families, so did physical and alcohol abuse. Leisner only became the mayor after one mayor suddenly resigned and moved away following the discovery of PCBs in the town, and his replacement had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized.
I had 8 brothers and 1 sister, and what we had as children growing up was bruises, scratches, a few stitches, maybe a broken arm. Nothing like my family. Every member of my family was ill with something different. So you have to believe that it's because of the exposure to the chemicals.
Then the board found out that the federal government likely knew about the contamination at Times Beach going all the way back to 1972, but did nothing to alert Times Beach residents in all that time. The whole thing reeked of a cover-up. The situation went all the way to the federal level, and in January 1983, President Reagan announced a Times Beach Dioxin Task Force. A month later, the EPA announced a federal buyout of the town for $33 million, just like that. It was the first time the government had ever done so in American history. The official quarantine began in 1985, but the town would not be demolished for another 7 years. Though thousands of lawsuits were subsequently filed against Bliss, IPC, and NEPACO, Russell Bliss was never convicted of any crime for what he did. Bliss claimed he was just a patsy, and he was never informed the waste he received could be hazardous. A defense that makes little sense in hindsight considering who his clients were.
I wasn't told what was in the oil. I wouldn't have known what it was if they had have told me what it was. If you want the truth, you could tell me it was some kind of a new jelly and I'd put it on toast and eat it.
He said, I'm the fall guy, I'm the scapegoat. All my friends say I'm the scapegoat and I took the fall. And he very much did, because everyone said, you're the guy that sprayed it on the street. You're the one that did that. You're the one that spread it all around. It doesn't really go back. I did go back to the chemical companies that did it, but they just had to pay fines into some super fund thing that goes to the state to clean it up. You know, nobody's paying into, say, a fund for some woman who lived there with her kids, when they find out 20 years on down the road they got cancer. I didn't see anything about that in all the stories that I read about it. What I saw was a bunch of companies ordered to pay large fines, and the face that was put on the bad guy of the story wasn't just dioxin, it was dioxin and Russell Bliss. It wasn't dioxin, Russell Bliss, and the pharmaceutical chemical companies, the agribusiness companies, and the United States for their Vietnam War activities. That wasn't the bad guy. The bad guy was Russell Bliss. So that's how this whole thing got worked, and that's, I think, why it was such a national attention, because they had like the scapegoat bad guy. It's dioxin, it's Russell Bliss.
As the cleanup finally began, the controversy only grew. An incinerator was placed at Times Beach in the mid-90s by Syntex, the company that bought out Nepico, where over 265,000 tons of dioxin-contaminated soil from more than 24 sites around Missouri would be incinerated. In fall 1997, the Justice Department quietly initiated a criminal inquiry into the disputed stack emissions test for the Times Beach dioxin incinerator, after 2 separate EPA and DNR reviews of said data revealed serious lapses in scientific protocol which cast doubt on whether the incinerator was functioning properly and legally protecting human health. One way dioxin is spread to begin with happens to be by incineration. It was also found that the laboratory that handled the stack emissions test samples was owned by the incinerator operating company, and the laboratory's quality assurance officer assigned to Times Beach was also involved in a trial burn at the U.S. Army Chemical Weapons Incinerator at Dugway Proving Ground, which was also under a separate investigation at the same time after Army whistleblowers came forward alleging that that incinerator wasn't working properly either. And despite the fact that Judy Pyatt, Mayor Leisner, and a civil attorney all recalled that PCBs had been found in the Times Beach Park, the EPA claimed in 1991 the PCBs, a highly toxic and non-biodegradable environmental pollutant, had somehow just magically vanished. End of story. It should be noted that from the 1930s until 1977, Monsanto was the largest PCB producer in the United States. An agricultural chemicals newsletter dated March 16, 1972 notes that at that time, Monsanto was the only domestic producer of PCBs. And despite disturbing emerging scientific evidence of the dangers, Monsanto, quote, continues to stand firm behind its contention that there is no scientific data that indicate polychlorinated biphenyls may cause birth defects. A lawsuit later resulted in the release of a 1975 letter from Monsanto which instructed Westinghouse to downplay the potential harm of PCBs to the company's employees, but privately admitted that polychlorinated biphenyls, quote, can have permanent effects on the human body. It would come out much later that Monsanto had been fully aware of how dangerous PCBs were, but continued to produce the toxic chemicals for another 8 years anyway, through 1977. Back at Times Beach, the EPA was quietly hauling over 4,400 tons of special waste off-site for some reason, to a landfill that had been cited by DNR in the past for potentially allowing waste to seep into the ground and contaminate groundwater. Not only that, but another EPA document dated 1982 came out, proving that that specific landfill had also likely been sprayed by Bliss a decade earlier. When questioned about it by reporters, everyone involved in the special dump cited confidentiality agreements with the EPA, and no one would talk. Worse, an employee of the engineering firm connected to this special landfill not only witnessed safety violations at the incinerator site, but found irregularities with the Times Beach soil sampling. Unfortunately, he died in a one-car accident before he could have his turn on the witness stand. Something was definitely being covered up. Riverfront Times also discovered that in 1982, the DOJ, then acting on behalf of the EPA and White House, withheld documents from a congressional investigation on the Times Beach cleanup, including handwritten notes of an EPA attorney pertaining to the Missouri dioxin sites and their proposed cleanup. They cited executive privilege and refused to turn the information over to Congress for reasons that remain secret to this day. Activist Taylor summed it up best when he said, "We believe this is more of a toxic waste shell game than a cleanup. We feel there's a lot of secrets, that this whole incineration project was about preserving those secrets and protecting commercial interests more than protecting public health." In August 1997, Taylor was hit with a legal action from the EPA using a provision of the Superfund law that's supposed to be preserved for corporate polluters, giving Taylor 1 week to turn over any information he and his group might have on the disposal of any hazardous waste generated by Monsanto, or face a fine of $25,000 a day until he did. The order came just 2 weeks after Taylor asked the St. Louis County Council to form a task force to independently investigate other contaminated sites overlooked by the EPA and DNR. Just a few weeks after the incinerator was shut off at Times Beach for the final time, the EPA announced it had found yet another dioxin-laced site in Ellisville. Today, a giant vented grassy mound of leftover debris from the town of Times Beach sits in the new Route 66 park the state turned the site into. A park as creepy and desolate as the abandoned husk of a town I remember driving by as a kid. The old roadhouse is the only original Times Beach building left standing. Used by the EPA as its headquarters during the cleanup, it has now been turned into a cheesy Route 66 museum and knick-knack gift shop. Only one tiny corner of the place has any information about the tragedy that befell Times Beach. And even that is set to spin the whole thing as one big triumph for the EPA. It's pretty insulting.
Wow, it's like there's nothing here. I mean, this horrible tragedy happened here. They could use it as an example to help people learn about environmental safety, health. Instead, they've just glossed over the whole thing by the opportunity, the fact that this place is near I-44, and turned it into a Route 66 museum, as if this part of the highway has anything to really do iconically with Route 66. I mean,
is there any other information about what happened at Times Beach? Because it didn't seem like there was very much here.
Well, what did you want to know?
About the whole dioxin disaster and how town was poisoned.
I can tell you.
You can?
Yeah.
Because we came to look at that stuff.
I thought there'd be more of it here. It just seems like there's one little
Yeah.
area, but there's not that much
Yeah.
about it.
Were you here at the time?
No,
Oh,
but I've read different things, different books and stuff,
okay.
and watched there's a DVD out there about it too.
Do they sell it here?
No. You could probably go online and just put something about Times Beach DVD.
Yeah.
And maybe you could contact it that way.
Well, why do you think they don't have more about it here?
Well, we don't want to focus just on that. You know, we did a whole wall and then another wall. But for the most part, this is a visitor center, so people are more or less from all over the world coming to do Route 66. So Times Beach is just one, part of what's going on.
It just seems like that buries the history kind of what actually happened here, because Route 66 goes for multiple states. You know what I mean? It's like not like this part of Route 66 is the iconic Route 66.
Right.
You wouldn't think of that for Eureka, Missouri. I'm sorry, I grew up near here, and I just remember we would drive down this part of I-44, and Times Beach was always what we would talk about every time. And I understand it's an environmental disaster, but it seems like it could have been used as a way to teach people about the dangers of that stuff. Or
well, there has been all kinds of stuff. Like I said, there's books and everything out there.
But they don't sell them here.
No.
Don't you think that's kind of strange?
I guess it just kind of, I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up around here and I know how it affected everybody here.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just, to come here and not have this be the place where they could teach people, educationally even, about.
Well, we have that in there.
Seems,
and like
yeah,
I said,
but it's mentioned one time in the very sparse timeline, and then maybe once on that other corner wall. It's that's the only place. I mean, you have a bigger section over there for the Coral Court Motel than you do about the thing that happened here, and that motel's not even in this town. I don't know. It just seems weird to me.
this was a roadhouse.
Oh, I know.
This is a historic roadhouse since the early 1930s.
Right, I know.
So when people come
right
to here, but
the park is over there, though.
So many more will come through and they see that little bit that's in there, and then they ask me questions about it here.
All right. Well, there you go. Thanks. I just can't believe how that lady downplayed that whole thing.
Well, I've traveled through Europe, I've been all over the US. Whenever there's some obscure battle on a place, they make a big deal. Here in 1850 whatever was the battle of such and such. Doesn't matter how famous it is to the whole earth. You go somewhere in Europe, say where a concentration camp was, or something important to the Holocaust, or World War II, Nazi Germany, they make a huge deal of it. They have a big commemoration, a whole psychological display confronting you with the horror, talking about how it will never happen again, the lessons that are going to be learned from it, documenting the tragedies that happen to individuals, but not here. If you get poisoned by dioxin from a chemical company in the United States, and then the EPA takes it over, cleans it up, and sweeps it under, and they put a state park over it, forget about it. Don't give the lives of people wondering if they were going to get cancer, or documenting how they did get sick later in life, or how they were economically turned over and destroyed by the tragedy that happened in this town. Don't give a warning about how this is how we're going to learn to treat chemicals better in the future, and everyone's going to play by better rules, and don't, portray the lives. No, just put it in a corner and say it's a triumph for EPA cleanup, and screw the lives of the people who lived here, right? Just don't even mention them, show a photo, but don't tell their personal story.
Yeah.
Do they do that at any other historical
I've
locations?
never seen that before. My favorite part is when she said, but this was a roadhouse. It's Route 66 because this was a roadhouse. I mean, yeah, this right here that we're driving on, this is technically Route 66 because it's Interstate 44 right here. But this is not the iconic part of Route 66 that people think of and they go, oh yes, Route 66. Well, that immediately reminds me of Eureka, Missouri. And for that lady to be like, this was a roadhouse. There were roadhouses all up and down Route 66 for all of the states that highway was in.
That weren't trumped and transformed by huge environmental disasters.
Exactly. That roadhouse that she's sitting there saying is so iconic, she failed to mention the fact that the EPA took that roadhouse over and used it as its headquarters when they were cleaning up the contamination of dioxin in the land just across the river. But it's a roadhouse. This is Route 66. And we're going to use this as an environmental triumph for the EPA, who may or may not have known about it for 10 years before they decided to finally go in and clean it up just to save face, while they were under congressional scrutiny for possibly cavorting with the very chemical companies involved.
In 2012, the EPA tested new soil samples from the park, and in November declared soil samples from Route 66 State Park show no significant health risks for park visitors or workers. Notice they didn't say the place was found clean and that there were no health risks, just that it posed no significant ones. Meanwhile, the long-term health effects on the residents of Times Beach are still unknown, despite the fact that everything was long ago demolished, buried, and burned. After looking at all the evidence of the Times Beach dioxin scare, it would seem that someone was covering up a much more dangerous chemical tied to a much larger, more powerful company.
Or the fact that she wouldn't even have a job if this hadn't happened to begin with. There would be no Route 66 State Park.
That whole disaster trumps every other history that was there and goes on top of it. It's totally backwards from the way they do history everywhere else. It's a clear indication that they want to sweep this under and not bring it out as a big historical point. It shows you how the victors write history. That's your lesson right there. That shows you. The plaque that the EPA put up was all about the triumph of an environmental cleanup, not a word about the tragedy of the disaster of the townspeople living under contamination and a supposed accidental dumping of this waste, or how we're going to learn the lessons from it or anything.